Ever since I started with game art, I've bought games for the explicit purpose of analyzing what they do well and figuring out what I can learn from them. This means I've encountered a lot of really cool artistic choices and techniques from some really cool games. So I thought I'd just cover some games and things I really appreciate about them, so that hopefully you can incorporate some of these things and improve your own game art. So I want to start by looking at Neva. Now there are a lot of things Neva does extremely well. Things such as the many awesome compositions and the work done to highlight every walkable platform. But I want to focus on another thing, and that is how Neva deals with negative space. So if you don't know, negative space is kind of the stuff you don't draw. So if I draw an intricate mushroom, then my negative space isn't the mushroom, but all the stuff that is not the mushroom. But why does what I don't draw matter? Well, suppose I draw this sword. It looks nice and distinct. It's clearly a sword. Now, while this sword looks nice here, I'm going to have to place it next to other assets. And if I place my sword here, it looks nice. But if I place my sword here, it doesn't look that nice. Now, why does it not look that nice here? Well, because we have ruined the negative space. Part of what makes my sword look nice and stand out is the silhouette. And if I place my sword in front of an asset that ruins that silhouette, then I am in essence ruining how my sword looks. It doesn't stand out and just looks messy. So even if it'd be nice if we only had to care about how we draw our assets, the truth is we often have to care equally much about how every single thing we draw fits together in a scene. We have to care about our negative space. We have to care about our composition. And doing this isn't easy. But Neva does it extremely well. Look at this spot. You might think right here that these are just some assets placed together, but we can clearly see this tree here. The shape is really distinct. It doesn't blend in with the stuff behind it. Then we look here in the corner, they're placing some brighter bush and rock thing here to create separation between this dark bush and this tree stem. This rock is also a fairly bright color, but because the rock is bright, now we go for a darker green behind the rock. So now the shape of the rock stands out. Okay, but now that we have a dark green here in this area, now our flower petals can't be dark. So now in order to make the petals stand out, they make them white. And now the shape of these flowers also stand out well. Wherever you look, this game really makes sure that the shape of each individual asset stands out fairly well against the assets behind it. Here we have a really dark foreground, basically just a silhouette. But we can also see that each silhouette stands out. But I want you to kind of just pay attention to this frame, because even if it looks unassuming, there's a lot of work that must have gone into it. It's dark here, then it gets bright here in the bottom area. It's kind of bright here, but here on the rock it gets dark again. And because the rocks here are dark, now the bushes here have to be brighter. And because these flowers are next to something kind of bright and something kind of dark, we have to make the flowers extra bright in order to make them stand out. Wherever you look, each asset is carefully placed in order to accentuate the silhouette of every single asset. And it does it so consistently that you can almost just pick any single frame from this game and just see the careful planning. Most of our inclination when drawing is to just pick a color for our tree and then place it in the scene. But if we look at this tree, the value, so the darkness of the tree trunk, can't just be any color. It can't be in this range, because it would blend in well with the background. It also can't be in this range, because then it would blend in with the rock. Here it's in this middle range, in between the rock and the background. And now the silhouette stands out, both at the bottom and at the top. Now obviously the tree could have been really dark as well, and it would have also stood out. My point, however, is just that these are things you have to care about if you want your scene and your assets to look good. So how can you figure out how to start doing this so that you also get nice looking art? Well, there is a proper way of doing it, which I suspect is what Neva does. And then there's the shitty patchwork solution, which I often use, and we'll go over both. But let's start with how I think Neva does it. Now Neva is made by the creators of Grizz, which is another great game with stunning art. And what I suspect that they do is to make a thumbnail sketch for every single scene in their game. And I don't mean thumbnail as in YouTube thumbnail, but as in a small sketch that just captures the idea of how their final scene is going to look. I don't think they begin any scene by drawing an asset. I think every single scene is created by just painting in shapes and silhouette. If you only draw with silhouettes, it becomes easier to handle the negative space, because that becomes essentially all that you're paying attention to. And once you have a sketch that you like, then you fill it in with assets. Now I quite often do this by just taking a screen grab of my tile map, then I paste it into my drawing software, and then I paint on top of that screen grab. This is generally good to do for a lot of reasons. It tells you which assets you need to draw, how dark or bright they need to be in order to stand out. It tells you whether you messed up, because if your final scene looks worse than the sketch, well, then you messed up. But now you can also kind of see how to fix it. More than that, it can often help you create these nice compositions that I mentioned earlier. One of my favorite art books of all time, Framed Ink, really shifted my perspective on how to make compositions, and did so by basically doing this stuff. Every single scene or image can be broken into rather abstract shapes or ideas. And if we learn how to create nice compositions with these abstract shapes, then from those abstract shapes, we can add detail, and now we have a nice image, or in our case, a fairly decent scene. Now, I don't think you need to do a thumbnail sketch all the time. An area like this in Animal Well is probably a planned composition. This area is probably planned the exact same way we planned our scene. On the other hand, I'm not sure an area like this has been planned out. It's just a small platforming sections. Here we have a planned composition, here we have a random platforming section, probably without any real plan. So because of this, I personally think it can be important to not just have a sense for how to deal with negative space in the planning stage, but also have an idea of what you can do if you have a scene that is already done, but it looks kind of muddy and has issues with negative space. So I want us to look at this scene. It's not really a bad scene, but I want to point out a few tricks you can use to improve your negative space in a scene like this. You don't have to use them, it can just be good to have these tools in your toolkit. So the first thing I want to focus on is just this dude in the pot. It's quite a distinct silhouette. Now there are lots of ways you could draw this dude. I tend to always use an outline or some line art. Now in the scene earlier, he kind of looked like this, with the edge highlighted. Now in this case it looks fine, but look what happens if we go for a bright blue background. Now this version with the outline still looks fine. Still a distinct silhouette. But for this version, we have completely ruined the negative space. And we largely ruined the negative space because we made the edge of our asset brighter. Now if we make the background darker, our outlined version still looks fine. And now this version with an outline also looks fine. But as we can see, having an outline tends to make it easier to deal with your negative space. We're allowed more freedom. We can go from bright to dark to something in between. Whereas with this version, we couldn't. But I want to show you what happens if we remove this bright edge. If we kind of make our asset flatter. Now if our background is bright, we still get that really distinct silhouette. And if we go dark, we still have a distinct silhouette. We can actually see that this is to a large extent what Neva does. It handles negative space really well by not overworking each asset. They don't highlight these edges here. This asset still has a texture on it, but I've kind of done less work here compared to here. But this asset is easier to work with. Because the asset is so simple, I can have significantly more freedom in terms of values that I have in the background. And obviously, if we have this gradient from here to here, and we aren't allowed to use any brighter color than this without ruining our negative space, it becomes quite difficult to do our staging. Now, this idea of negative space does affect any art style you have. But as you can see, outlining our shape tends to always make our negative space easier to notice. And in that particular regard, it becomes easier to shade and easier to work with. It's part of the reason why I tend to use an outline. But at its core, you can often fix your negative space after you already have a scene like this by just shifting the contrast and the values of your asset. This hill here, or this trident here, they're fairly dark, but they're still kind of close in value to the thing behind it. So maybe we should make it a bit darker, like black. And well, there you go, more separation. Now if you don't want to play around with the assets in this way, or you don't want your foreground layer to be completely black, you could just pay more attention to where you place things. If you want the skull not to blend in with the pillar, then perhaps don't place it in front of the pillar. Move the skull to a place that doesn't interfere with the negative space as much. Now this helps a bit, but if we want this shape to be even more distinct, and we don't want to adjust the asset, we can still make it brighter behind the skull. For instance, we could place a light behind the asset. Now this edge here becomes more distinct without that much added labor. We can obviously do this for this layer as well. If we don't want to change the asset, we can just add a light at the bottom edge here. And now we partly get this fancy light, but more importantly, this light increases the separation on this edge here. All in all, when I think about how to make nice compositions and nice scenes, I often look at Neva and Grizz. But I've talked about this for quite some time already, so let's move on to the next game and our next technique. And the next game I want to talk about is Bzzzt. It has nice designs, nice colors, it's a great looking game. But what I want to talk about is something I think it does exceptionally well. And that is how it handles tonal ranges. And I'm sorry for throwing in a lot of fancy art words. The tonal range is just the range from our darkest dark to our brightest bright. So this range. So what do I mean when I say a game handles this range well? Sounds kind of odd, but let me show you. If you just take a screen grab of this previous scene and open it in our drawing software. And now if you look at our histogram in the corner here, it looks like this. Now this looks like a really weird and confusing graph, but it isn't that complicated. But if I just show you this histogram for a gradient. This is that same histogram, but for this gradient image. Now we can kind of see what this graph is trying to represent. You see these spikes here? Each color here corresponds to a spike in that graph. So if I select my picker tool here and pick this light gray, we can see this light gray corresponds to this spike. If I take my picker tool and move this, now it corresponds to this spike. So if we go back to our picture in grayscale and look at our graph, can we guess what this little small point here is? Well, it's our character. The only bright thing in this entire scene is our character. But if you actually try and look for the brightest spot in the environment and use our picker tool and select it, it's right here at the spot. So our brightest thing in the entire environment is really, really dark. It would correspond to this color maybe, tonal range. We're not using any of this, only this. So we're only playing around with these really dark colors. Even worse than that, our dark stuff isn't even that dark. Like what happens if we color pick the trident here in the foreground? Well, it's obviously dark. We can see it's really close to the edge, but it's not black. Why isn't it black? It could be black. We're sort of squishing everything to be right here in this middle. We're using quite little of the black, or we're using none of the bright. It's all in this kind of dark, muddy gray tone. This is the reason I said we could benefit from making the foreground a bit black, because it would increase our tonal range, and because we increase our tonal range, it also helps us to separate assets and improve our negative space. So how does this graph look for Bzzzt? Well, I said it handled tonal ranges really well. So let's compare our graph to this frame in Bzzzt. If we first make it grayscale, to just make it simpler, and then we look at our histogram, the curve looks like this. So here we have them side by side. This is the one for Bzzzt, and this is our previous one. Sure, Bzzzt doesn't really use any black, but you can see how it makes use of this entire tonal range. All of these colors are used, compared to me, who hates brightness and only wants to play around in the dark. Now, as I mentioned, one issue with a low tonal range is that we will have fewer colors we can pick to separate assets from each other in our composition. You know how I mentioned how Neva would pick a brighter white color for the flower here in order to accentuate the negative space? Well, this is only possible if you actually make use of a brighter white color, which I don't do here. Now, all of this is kind of complex. You don't have to use the entire tonal range, but as we can see, it does affect the composition. But it also does something more. Using your entire tonal range makes your scene have some vibrancy. It makes your game pop. If you never make use of your tonal range, your game can end up looking somewhat flat. And I don't say this as someone who is good at this stuff, but precisely the opposite. I'm kind of bad at making use of the tonal range. This is another one of my scenes. Now we can see for this scene that I'm clearly using more of the tonal range, but I'm still not using anything here, and here I'm actually not using any black. And we can see it's not that vibrant. So how would this graph look for Hollow Knight? Now we can see that the histogram is really busy on the dark side here, but there isn't really an empty spectrum here. There's still colors here. It doesn't have this empty space here, the way I tend to do it. This is actually a fairly decent graph of mine, but we can see even when I do it well, I still don't make use of the entire tonal range. I pretty much never do. But you can see how in basically any scene I make, if you just check the histogram, I just stop at some point and don't make use of the bright colors. Whereas for Hollow Knight, it doesn't stop. There's still some colors here. We can also compare this to a game that is kind of famous for being vibrant, Ori. And sure, this graph looks like it tapers off significantly. But if you just use the picker tool, we can see if we pick this is bright. It really does have a lot of bright things in the scene. The only difference is that these bright things don't really occupy that much space. So they don't occupy that much space in the graph. But it is there. There is stuff here. And we can see this if we color pick it. Whereas here, it doesn't matter how much you tried. There is no stuff here. It's completely flat. There is nothing that occupies this part of the tonal range. I know this because I drew it. So why do I bring this up? What is the trick? What is it that I think you can take away from this? Well, I think it's very easy to just draw your assets and get used to the colors you pick, and then end up with something kind of nice. Like my art, it's kind of nice. The question shouldn't be, is this nice? But rather, could it be nicer? And I think it can be worthwhile to just compare your own histograms, your own colors, to other games, like I've done here, to see if you have any obvious blind spots. Blind spots like you can see in my game art. Now this issue I have with my own art isn't news to me. I've discussed it in a Patreon video before. Even worse than that, I've tried to compensate for it for a really long time in one particular scene. This one. I kind of like this scene, but it's incredibly dark. It doesn't look like this. my recording of it actually looks like this. This is how it looks after I've made it brighter in my editing software. And if we look at the histogram of it, we can see how little of the tonal range I'm actually using. It's nothing. No one would think the scene is vibrant. I only use the darkest values possible. I honestly have no idea why this happened, but looking at your histograms can sort of help you notice these type of mistakes. Because it is a mistake. This scene is too dark. Anyway, I might look into how my game art would look if I made it more vibrant in the future, but I just wanted to highlight how quite often when you see a game, and you notice how vibrant and nice it feels, that vibrancy can often be seen in stuff like the histograms. And if you want to improve your own vibrancy, well, then you should investigate what you're doing wrong. But now I want to move on and talk about our next game. And the next game I want to talk a bit about is Nine Sols. And just like the other games, they do a lot of really cool stuff. The intermix between 2D and 3D is really cool. The environment design is really cool. But I want to talk about effects. So I want us to just look at these bubbles here. They look nice. And I want us to look at this fight. And I want us to look at both the attack animation and the blood. Okay, this does look nice. But what's special about it? Well, I think beyond just looking nice, the developers actually does something really well that I feel some games kind of ignore. The effects in Nine Sols are incredibly consistent with the rest of the art style. Now, I don't want to bash a game, but I want us to just compare the effects of Nine Sols to Tesla Grad 2. Take a look at this small section. Now, if I pause this frame, now I just want you to try and imagine how a visual effect would look like in this game. What's the style of the visual effect that would fit the rest of this art style? Try and imagine it. And now if I unpause, we see this. Is it like you imagined? Because I would argue that even though the effect looks nice and looks cool, it doesn't really fit the style. And I think this is really tricky to get right. Like the waterfall here looks like it fits the game really well. But there's just something about this red glow here that feels out of place. I think this water pattern here looks almost right, but this bubbly water line definitely feels off to me. If you compare this to Nine Sols, I don't know how they do it, but every single effect in this game just fits really well with the game's aesthetic. Here we do have some glow, but it's incorporated well. And on these wall platforms, they make sure to add this small outline to the effect to match their line art in the rest of the game. These effects aren't just about them looking nice individually, but just look at how nice this red lighting stuff fits with the rest of the game. If we look back at these bubbles, I want to just highlight again how these bubbles don't just look nice. They really fit well with the rest of the style. They're outlined in this nice bubbly way, and if we take a screen grab, it kind of looks like an artist has drawn these bubbles. Here's an attempt that I've previously made of this kind of bubble vibe, and it kind of works. It kind of fits, but these bubbles are just a small texture that I use as a particle. They don't quite have that cool animation that you see in Nine Sols. And I want to highlight how difficult it is to get all of your effects to look both good and fit exceptionally well with the rest of the game. Look at these cute little cloud things. It just works. Now, I don't know exactly how I would try and make these. A big problem with some of the effects, such as the ones you see in Gris, is that they look nice and fit really well, but they're really labor intensive to make. A lot of this is hand animated. But I still think it's worthwhile to really consider your own style before you make effects. Look at what you can achieve and try and achieve it. If your game looks like Ori and the rest of the aesthetic, or perhaps like Halls of Torment, then by all means, make your effects that way. But if your game has a similar art to mine, then maybe try to learn more from Nine Sols. So the next thing I want to talk about is a kind of weird and difficult skill that I feel often gets overlooked. And it's a thing that Gunbrella does extremely well. That is consistency. But I don't mean stylistic consistency, but rather thematic consistency. Now, in the same way you don't want to have different art styles for different assets, you also really want every asset to feel like it belongs to the same world. What do I mean by this? Well, let's look at Gunbrella. I really like the look of this game, but I don't want us to gush over it looking nice. I want to talk about the assets they choose to make. Every single asset fits the world. We as the audience can kind of see this game and immediately think, oh, this is like 19th century American frontier stuff. Now, I do know that it feels important to know how to draw something that looks pretty, but thematic consistency is so important. A lot of the time, the reason why bot assets kind of fall flat, it's not only about stylistic consistency, but it's that whatever game you're making really has no soul. It doesn't try to communicate anything. It's just pretty. And if you compare that to Gunbrella, even the color choice aims to convey that old-timey feel. They could have picked any colors, but instead they went for something quite sepia-toned, which reminds us of old 19th century photography. Now they do this with everything. The scrapyard feels like a scrapyard with no regulations. The swamp feels swampy. Now one could argue that it's perhaps a bit weird that the train is spray painted with "oh yeah," but I just want to highlight the desire to make every asset, every piece of the world have character. The menus, the HUD, even the characters have character. I just really want you, when you make your game, to think about it, because it's so easy to overlook. Think about whether you can make it fit your story or your setting. This is often why any big project will invest a lot of money into concept art, because good art isn't just pretty art. Now, I personally don't think it's that valuable to spend a lot of time developing concept art if you're doing a solo project, because you don't have to develop your concepts with anyone else. But having a good core idea of what your game is about is important. If you need concept art to have a feeling for what your game is about, then invest time in concept art. If you already have a strong sense for it, then rely on that sense. Rely on your gut. I don't do a lot of concept art, but I do have a sense for where I'm going with my art. But a lot of this stuff about having a consistent theme, I have talked about before. What I haven't talked about before when it comes to themes is just how easy it can be to make a consistent theme, but a boring theme. If we look at Super Magbot, it's a game that I think is a legitimately fun platformer. On top of that, the aesthetics are also nice. It's pretty and clearly made by good artists. I just kind of feel like the game aesthetically lacks vision. You're kind of a generic robot. And first you play in a forest environment, then you play in an ice environment, and then a lava environment. It's not bad, it's just kind of expected. It doesn't stick out. Now, I don't think you necessarily have to stick out. We have games like A Robot Named Fight that has a clear, consistent theme that isn't new or refreshing. It's obviously quite similar to Metroid, Axiom Verge, or Ghost Song, which are all similar to each other. I don't think any of these games are particularly refreshing, but they do target their audience well, and they've sold pretty well because of it. But even though I do think you can get away with sort of expected choices, I do think it can be dangerous to make artistic choices that are kind of safe and boring. The kind of ice and lava environments that everyone kind of knows because it's so common. And I think a portion of what makes a game like Nine Souls sell is the vibes. They made something that feels different and fun. The gameplay obviously makes that purchase the right choice, but as I said, I think Super Magbot is fun. It just doesn't look that enticing. It doesn't stand out. Okay, I've only talked about why this is important, and I mentioned games that do it well. But how would you go about creating refreshing and new ideas? Well, honestly, I think the best way to make something that feels fresh in terms of games is to make sure you aren't just inspired from games. I've talked many times about how I tend to buy books from secondhand stores. And the reason I do this is precisely because of the strange new designs or ideas you can get. Like, look at this small little book on Anthony Gaudi. Now, he's an extremely famous architect, but if I got influenced by any design in this tiny book and made some game art with it, it would feel kind of fresh in the context of a game. Like, this is kind of cool. Or take this jewelry book. Really interesting and cool designs. And if I got inspired and made game art influenced by some of these styles, it would feel unique to basically anyone that doesn't happen to be big into jewelry. I actually think this book is quite a funny example of modern art, because it starts out really cool and interesting, and then just kind of goes crazy. Like, this is cool, but what's this? Or this? It's just odd. As an aesthetic choice, this is kind of bad. But as a crazy character, yeah, it could work. Or like this thing. I don't even know what this is. But I mean, as a character design, it would be equally odd to Pyramid Head from Silent Hill, and that is a kind of beloved character. All of this to say, I think if you feel that you make too boring choices, perhaps you just need to consume more art. There's a lot of interesting stuff out there. While I personally think I make rather bland and boring choices at times, if I ever make something interesting, it's not that I just have a unique mind. I actually consume a lot of stuff that helps develop my taste. Stuff like this. You can support me on Patreon if you want. Thanks for watching. Bye.